Early September is usually when I take a few days away from work. I'm 43, a civil engineer, and after long project deadlines I try to reset somewhere quiet. Over the years I've learned I relax better in structured campgrounds than deep wilderness. The organized layout, gravel loops, numbered sites, predictable distances, feels familiar after months of urban construction sites. That particular trip was a simple 2-night stay at a national forest campground in northern Wisconsin. My routine rarely changes. Arrive before dusk, set up a small tent, cook something basic, then sit beside a fire and read until I'm tired enough to sleep. If you enjoy listening to grounded personal accounts like this, you're welcome to subscribe for more. The evening air carried the dry rustle of pine needles, shifting whenever wind passed through the trees. My site was marked campsite number 14, positioned near the far edge of a small loop road. I arrived mid-afternoon on a Thursday. The campground looked nearly empty. I counted 3 other vehicles spaced around the loop road, and nothing else moving. The campground host's site sat near the entrance, but the small wooden kiosk had a handwritten sheet taped to it that read, "Back Friday morning." That meant the place would probably stay quiet overnight. I pitched a small 2-person tent beside my SUV and parked the vehicle nose out the way I always do, mostly out of habit. Afterward, I walked the loop just to get a sense of where everything was. 2 sites down, I noticed a weathered green tent already pitched at campsite number 12, maybe 60 feet from mine. No cooler, no lantern, no person nearby, just the tent sitting quietly among the trees. Somewhere across the campground, a car door closed, the sound echoing faintly through the woods. Around dusk, I walked toward the restroom building near the center of the loop. Passing campsite number 12, I noticed the tent was zipped closed. A folding lawn chair sat a few feet from the fire ring, pointed almost directly toward my campsite. I didn't think much about it at the time. Camp chairs get left wherever people last used them. When I came back 20 minutes later, the chair had been turned slightly toward the road instead. The change was small enough that I assumed the camper must have stepped out while I was gone and moved it. A metal chain on the campground flagpole tapped rhythmically in the breeze. The chair itself was old, aluminum frame, faded blue webbing stretched across the seat and back. I started dinner just after sunset, heating something simple over a small stove. While sitting near the fire ring, I glanced toward campsite number 12 again. The chair was facing my tent now. I didn't remember it being positioned that way earlier. No voices carried through the campground. No footsteps. No vehicle doors. The place felt strangely still. Later, while brushing my teeth at the restroom sink, I happened to look through the window facing the campsites. In the reflection of the fluorescent lights, I could see the neighboring site behind me. The chair had shifted again. This time it was angled toward the restroom path. Back at my fire ring, I started paying closer attention. Every time I stepped away from my campsite, even briefly, the chair's position seemed different when I returned. The green tent never opened. No lantern glow appeared inside it. Without really deciding to, I began checking the time whenever I noticed a change. The first moment I felt certain there was a pattern was 8:42 p.m. If you appreciate slow burn stories where the details matter, feel free to leave a like. Above the trees, the wind moved steadily, creating a soft hiss across the treetops. Around 10 that night, I walked toward the restroom again. Halfway down the gravel path, I stopped. Instead of continuing, I stood completely still and watched campsite number 12 from a distance. The chair sat angled toward the empty road. For nearly a minute, nothing happened. Then I heard a faint scraping sound. Very slowly, the aluminum legs dragged across the gravel. The chair rotated a few inches. I never saw anyone touching it. When the movement stopped, the seat faced directly toward the place where I was standing. The distance between us couldn't have been more than 70 feet. The scraping sound lingered in the quiet for a moment, then disappeared. I returned to my campsite without using my headlamp and sat beside the fire. From where I was sitting, I could see the outline of the neighboring site through the trees. For several minutes, nothing changed. Then the scraping sound came again. The chair rotated slightly, lining up with where I sat near the fire ring. I decided to test it. I stood and walked behind my SUV, so the vehicle blocked the view from campsite number 12. About a minute passed. Scrape. When I stepped out from behind the vehicle, the chair had turned toward the SUV. I tried again. This time I walked toward the edge of the road as if leaving the campsite. The sound followed a moment later, the slow drag of aluminum against gravel. The chair shifted again. It now faced the road. Eventually, curiosity pushed me to try something else. I circled quietly through the trees, approaching campsite number 12 from behind, so I could see the site without standing in its line of view. Up close, the tent looked slightly collapsed, the way nylon does when it hasn't been used in a while. The chair sat beside the fire ring facing the path where I had just been standing. No person, no gear, no movement. I stepped forward carefully. The chair jerked a few inches with a sharp scraping sound. That was enough for me. Whatever explanation existed, I didn't need to watch it happen again. I backed away, returned to my vehicle, and sat inside with the doors locked. The dashboard clock read 11:17 p.m. I decided not to stay the night. I packed methodically the way I would at the end of any normal trip, though faster than usual. Sleeping bag into the trunk, stove in its case, tent folded down in the dark. I kept the headlights off while loading everything, mostly out of instinct. Each time I looked toward the neighboring site, the chair was still pointed in my direction. The wind had almost stopped by then. The trees were quiet. When the last bag was in the back seat, I started the SUV and slowly drove toward the exit. As I passed campsite number 12, my headlights illuminated dust drifting in the air above the gravel. The chair sat beside the empty fire ring, facing the place where my campsite had been. The dashboard clock read 11:34 p.m. As the vehicle rolled past, the beam of my headlights swept across the green tent. The zipper door was partly open now. Inside there was nothing. No sleeping bag, no backpack, no lantern, just bare ground and shadow. The chair had been repositioned again, this time exactly at the edge of the fire ring, facing the road where my SUV had been parked earlier. I didn't stop. The tires echoed hollowly across the gravel loop as I drove out of the campground. The next morning, out of curiosity more than anything, I looked up the campground reservation page. According to the website, site number 12 had been closed for maintenance from September 3rd through the 7th. I've camped alone many times since then. Chairs shift in the wind. Campsites sometimes look abandoned when someone's simply away for a hike. There are practical explanations for most things people find unsettling outdoors. But I've never again watched an object reposition itself repeatedly in response to where I happen to be standing. What I remember most isn't the movement. It's the quiet scraping sound of aluminum legs dragging slowly across gravel, and the way that empty chair kept turning toward me in the dark. If this account stayed with you, consider sharing it with someone who appreciates grounded horror like this. And you're welcome to subscribe if you'd like to hear the next one. Mid-May is one of the few times I travel purely for myself. I'm 42, a wildlife photographer, and the weeks just before tourist season tend to be the quietest in the Adirondacks. Most campgrounds reopen around then, but very few people bother coming until summer. That quiet is exactly what I want. If you enjoy listening to grounded personal accounts like this, you're welcome to subscribe for more. My plan was simple: 2 nights at a small lakeside campground, photographing water birds at dawn. The sites were primitive but clearly marked, spaced along the shoreline so each camper had a clean view of the water. My routine never really changes. I wake before sunrise, walk the lake with my camera, then come back for breakfast once the light turns harsh. That evening a thin layer of mist drifted slowly across the still lake water. I was assigned campsite B6, roughly 30 yards from the shoreline. I arrived late in the afternoon and drove the short gravel loop that ran along the lake. Only 2 other sites appeared occupied, both several hundred yards away along the shore. A park ranger passed through while I was unloading my gear. He slowed briefly and mentioned that black bears had been spotted earlier that week. I'd heard the same warning many times before, so I followed the usual precautions. Each campsite had a metal food locker bolted into the ground. I stored anything scented inside it before setting up my tent. Before sunset, I walked down along the shoreline to check the light for the next morning's photography. Small waves tapped gently against the rocks as the lake moved under the wind. That's when I noticed the first set of footprints leading from the water up toward the treeline. Near the trailhead stood a yellow wildlife warning sign dated May 12th. The next morning I walked down to the shore before sunrise with my camera. The mist was thicker than the night before, and the lake surface was almost perfectly flat. Somewhere across the water a loon called once, its echo carrying over the mist. The footprints I had noticed the evening before were still there. They were clear enough to make out the tread pattern, a boot with a triangular heel design. What caught my attention was their direction. They started at the edge of the water and moved inland toward the trees. There were no tracks leading toward the lake. At the time, I assumed the ground had hardened overnight, preserving only the most recent prints. It didn't seem worth thinking about further. Over the course of the day, I kept encountering similar tracks. Whenever I walked another stretch of shoreline, I would notice the same pattern, boot prints starting close to the waterline and moving toward the forest. None of them returned toward the lake. Because I spend a lot of time photographing wildlife tracks and environmental patterns, I started taking pictures of them casually. My assumption was that hikers were approaching the lake from somewhere behind the treeline, and I simply hadn't seen the connecting trail. But late that afternoon, something about the pattern began to bother me. The shoreline trail only approached the lake from one direction. Behind the footprints, there were no other marks in the soil, no scuffed leaves, no broken branches. It looked increasingly like the tracks began directly at the water's edge, as if people had stepped out of the lake and walked into the woods. The air smelled of damp earth warming in the afternoon sun. The timestamp on the last photograph I took of the tracks read 4:16 p.m. If you enjoy slow, observational stories like this, a like lets me know. Just before sunset, I sat quietly near the shoreline with my camera resting beside me. Birds often returned to feed around that time, and I didn't want to disturb the area by moving around too much. The lake was calm enough that every sound carried clearly. That was when I noticed something about 30 yards away. A fresh footprint appeared in the wet sand. I hadn't seen anyone approach the shore. No one was standing nearby. For a moment I wondered if I'd simply missed someone stepping past the mist. Then another footprint formed a little farther inland. The sand compressed with a soft suction sound. The spacing between them looked natural, about 2.5 feet apart, like someone walking slowly toward the trees. I stayed completely still. My first thought was that someone must be standing just outside my field of view. Another footprint appeared, then another. They continued moving slowly toward the treeline, one step at a time. Behind them, the water remained perfectly still. No ripples, no disturbance. If someone had walked out of the lake, there should have been some sign of movement. I stood carefully and walked closer. The impressions were deep and clear, identical to the triangular boot pattern I'd seen earlier. When I stepped beside the nearest one to compare sizes, the next footprint appeared directly in front of me. The sand compressed quietly. Instinctively, I stepped backward. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then another print formed closer to where I was standing. It didn't move again after that. The lake had gone completely silent. No birds, no wind, just the flat, motionless water behind the prints. I remember looking down at my camera in my hand. The shutter counter still read 0000. I never thought to take a photograph. I walked back to my campsite slowly, staying well away from the shoreline. By then the sun had dropped behind the trees, and the temperature was already falling. Instead of cooking dinner the way I had planned, I began packing my camera gear. The campground remained quiet. I never saw the other campers during that time. No voices carried through the woods. I lit a small fire mostly for the light while I organized my equipment. The drywood cracked softly as it burned lower. At some point I decided there wasn't any reason to stay another night. I set my alarm early and left everything packed by the tent. According to the timestamp on my vehicle log, I drove out of the campground at 5:07 a.m. Later that week I was reviewing my photos at home. Most of them were ordinary shots of shoreline, trees, and early season bird activity. While scrolling through one of the images from that afternoon, something in the background caught my attention. The photo file was labeled img_3827.cr2. It showed the section of shoreline where I had been studying the footprints earlier. When I zoomed in, I could see a faint line of impressions leading from the lake toward the forest. But the first few prints didn't start at the shoreline. They appeared several feet out over the water's surface. The quiet hum of my computer fan was the only sound in the room while I looked at the image. I've spent years studying animal tracks and natural disturbances in the environment. There are logical explanations for most things people misinterpret outdoors. Wind shifts sand. Water distorts edges. Human perception fills gaps. But I've never found a reasonable explanation for footprints that appear one step at a time while someone is watching. Sometimes when I'm reviewing shoreline photos now, I remember the exact moment it happened. The quiet compression of wet sand, and the image of a single fresh boot print forming about 3 feet in front of me. If this account stayed with you, consider sharing it with someone who appreciates grounded horror like this. You're welcome to subscribe if you'd like to hear the next account. Early October is when I usually try to take a short trip before winter settles in. I'm 45 and teach high school history, which means the school year tends to run at a steady pace once September passes. By that point, most of the summer crowds have disappeared from public campgrounds, and the quiet returns. If you enjoy listening to grounded personal accounts like this, you're welcome to subscribe for more. That weekend I chose a small Forest Service campground in Central Oregon, tucked along a narrow canyon where a cold river runs between steep rock walls. I prefer simple routines on trips like that: an afternoon hike, an early dinner, and an hour reading beside the fire before turning in. Even from the campsite, I could hear the river moving below the canyon rim, cold water rushing steadily through stone. My space was marked by a small wooden post labeled Site 7. I arrived just before sunset and drove slowly along the gravel loop looking for my site. The campground looked almost empty. I noticed only one other vehicle parked near the entrance, an older black pickup truck sitting beside Site 2. Something about it stood out immediately. The truck had no license plate on the rear. I assumed it belonged to someone already fishing along the river. The canyon trail dropped down to the water about 100 yards from the entrance, and it was common for people to leave their vehicles while they walked down to the shoreline. I finished setting up my small tent and lit a fire as dusk settled across the canyon. From where I sat, I could hear the steady clatter of river stones shifting in the current far below. The pickup never moved. After dinner, I took a short walk toward the river trail. On the way, I passed the pickup again. The driver's door was slightly open. Not wide, just a narrow gap, maybe 6 inches. I paused for a moment, expecting someone to be nearby, but the interior looked completely empty from where I stood. The campsite beside the truck was also bare. No tent, no cooler, no lantern. Just the vehicle parked beside the gravel. I assumed the owner must have walked down to the river earlier and left the door cracked by accident. The temperature had dropped quickly by then, and a cool wind moved slowly down through the canyon. Over the next couple of hours, I noticed the truck several more times. The restroom building sat on the opposite side of the campground loop, so I passed the entrance area each time I walked that direction. Every time I looked over, the door remained open the same distance. Exactly the same. No wider, no narrower. There were still no signs of anyone returning from the river. No flashlight beams moving along the trail. No voices echoing up from the canyon floor. Around 9:30 p.m., I realized something else that didn't quite make sense. The interior dome light wasn't on. Most vehicles automatically turn that light on when a door is open, especially at night. Yet the inside of the truck remained completely dark. Later, as I walked back from the restroom, I happened to glance toward the entrance again. The door moved. Slowly, it swung shut by itself. When it clicked closed, the truck's headlights flashed once. The engine never started. The sound echoed hollowly across the quiet campground. My watch read 9:37 p.m. If you appreciate slow, observational stories like this, a like lets me know. Standing there, I realized something that hadn't occurred to me earlier. I hadn't seen another person anywhere in the campground. Not walking the trail. Not returning to a campsite. Not moving near the truck. From where I stood, I could see part of the driver's seat through the windshield. It looked slightly reclined, though the angle made it difficult to be sure. For a moment I considered walking closer, just to confirm whether someone might still be inside. But something about the silence of the place stopped me. The river noise below suddenly seemed much louder. My campsite was about 120 feet from the truck. I went back and sat beside the fire instead. Sometime around 11 I woke inside my tent. At first I thought it was the wind. Then I heard the sound again, gravel crunching slowly outside. The sound of a vehicle moving. My first thought was that the person who owned the pickup had finally returned. Through the thin fabric of the tent, I saw headlights sweep briefly across the trees. I unzipped the door quietly and looked out. The truck was no longer parked near the entrance. It was sitting directly beside my campsite. The engine was off. The driver's door was open again. The same narrow 6-inch gap. No one stood nearby. I stepped out of the tent and scanned the surrounding trees. The canyon walls blocked most of the moonlight, leaving the campground dim and still. There was no movement anywhere. Then the headlights flickered once. Just a brief flash. The engine never turned over. At that moment I decided I didn't need to understand what had happened. I walked calmly to my own vehicle, started the engine, and sat for a moment while it warmed. The quiet ticking of the cooling engine echoed softly through the cold air. The clock on my dashboard read 11:18 p.m. I drove out of the campground slowly with my headlights on low beam. The gravel road curved past the entrance where the truck had originally been parked. As I passed, I looked back once toward the loop road. The pickup remained beside Site 7, exactly where I had left it. The driver's door was still open the same narrow distance. No one stood beside the vehicle. No movement appeared anywhere around it. After a minute, the road curved away, and the campground disappeared behind the canyon wall. My tires hummed softly once the gravel turned to pavement. At the roadside stood a wooden sign reading, Crooked River Campground, elevation 3,820 feet. The next afternoon, I looked up the campground on the Forest Service website. I was mostly curious whether any incidents had been reported. Nothing like that appeared in the news or the ranger reports. But while scrolling through the seasonal notices, I saw something unexpected. A maintenance bulletin posted for that location. According to the notice, the campground had officially closed for winter preparation the day before my trip. The timestamp on the announcement read, October 3 to 4 p.m. I remember sitting quietly at my desk, the faint clicking of my mouse the only sound in the room. I've thought about returning there once or twice. Part of me wonders if the truck belonged to someone who arrived late after the closure notice, the same way I did. But I've never found a reason strong enough to make the drive back. What stays with me most isn't the headlights flickering or the vehicle moving. It's the door, that narrow gap that never changed, the faint metallic click of a vehicle door stopping halfway, and the memory of that 6-inch opening still waiting beside my campsite in the dark. If this account stayed with you, consider sharing it with someone who appreciates grounded horror like this. And you're welcome to subscribe if you'd like to hear the next one.